I moved into the old house on a chilly autumn afternoon, the kind where the wind whistles through the cracks in the windows and dead leaves scatter across the empty streets. The place had been vacant for years, tucked away at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, a forgotten corner of the world. It was the only house on the block without the comforting noise of children playing or neighbors passing by. No one seemed to notice the house except for me. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a fresh start. I didn't mind that it was run down or that the rent was suspiciously cheap. The landlord handed me the keys with a curt nod, eyes a little too distant, and muttered something I couldn't quite catch about the window. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and getting used to the creaks and groans of the old place. But then I began noticing the cat. It started subtly. I'd catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye. A black cat, perched on the windowsill in the living room. Each time I turned to look, it would vanish, leaving nothing but the lingering feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't own a cat, and the landlord hadn't mentioned one. The first time I saw it fully was on a late night, when I couldn't sleep. I'd made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, and there it was, sitting in the moonlit window, eyes glowing like embers. It stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, but I shook it off, thinking it must have wandered in from outside. I approached slowly, thinking I could scare it away. But as I got closer, the cat didn't move. It sat perfectly still, its gaze never breaking from mine. Something about its eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. There was something else, something knowing. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the latch on the window, hoping to shoo it away. Before I could open it, the cat disappeared. Simply blinked out of existence, as if it had never been there. I stood there, hand frozen on the latch, heart pounding in my chest. But the sightings continued. Sometimes it was there in the morning, waiting for me when I drew back the curtains. Other times, I'd catch it sitting outside in the overgrown garden, watching the house from a distance. Always watching, and always from the same window. By the second week, I stopped trying to open the window. The cat would appear, and I would simply walk away, pretending it wasn't there. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching not just the house, but me. It wasn't until the noises started that I truly began to feel the weight of something dark hanging over the house. It began with faint scratching sounds, coming from the walls. At first, I thought it might be rats or some other pest living in the old walls, but the sounds were too deliberate, too precise, like nails scraping down the wood. And always at night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint scratching and the occasional tap-tap-tap, as if something was trying to get out. One evening, as I sat on the couch, flipping through an old book to distract myself, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room had grown unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The cat was there again, perched on the sill, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, just beyond the glass, was something else. Something darker, a shadowy figure standing in the gloom. I could barely make out its shape, but it was tall, too tall, its outline wavering like smoke in the moonlight. The cat's eyes glowed, reflecting the faint light from the street lamps outside, but the figure's face, it had no face. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had been glued to the couch, my limbs heavy, my throat dry. The figure leaned closer to the window, and for a moment, I thought it might come inside. But instead, it raised one long, thin arm and pointed at me. The cat let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air, its eyes never leaving mine. I sat there, paralyzed, as the scratching in the walls grew louder, more frantic. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the darkness, and the cat vanished. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every noise, every creak of the house sent waves of fear through me. I began to realize that the cat wasn't just an ordinary animal. It was a warning, a sentry, and whatever it was guarding against was coming closer. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom window rattling. It shook violently, the glass panes vibrating as if someone was on the other side, trying to break in. Heart racing, I stumbled out of bed and rushed to the window, expecting to see the cat again. But this time there was nothing, just the empty street, bathed in pale moonlight. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe whatever haunted the house had finally left. Then I heard it, the sound of claws dragging across the floor behind me. Slowly I turned around. There, sitting in the middle of the room, was the black cat. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence, and for the first time, it made a sound. A deep, guttural hiss that echoed in the empty room. Behind it, just beyond the doorway, I saw the shadow again. Only this time it wasn't outside. It was in the house, and it was coming for me. Couldn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the cat, its black fur blending into the darkness of the room, making it seem like a part of the very shadows around me. But it was the thing standing behind the cat that kept me frozen. The shadow, tall, faceless, and unnervingly still, seemed to seep from the doorway like ink bleeding into water. It didn't move. Neither did I. My mind raced with irrational thoughts. How long had it been there? Was it waiting for something? Was the cat controlling it, or was it controlling the cat? The black cat's glowing eyes didn't waver. Slowly, deliberately, it stood and took a step toward me, its tail flicking with a strange, menacing grace. I felt the temperature in the room drop even further, an icy breath that pricked my skin. My legs trembled beneath me, and I didn't know whether I was talking to the shadow, the cat, or both. "Get out of my house." The shadow figure didn't flinch. It loomed in the doorway like a terrible void, a presence that was far more than just darkness. The cat, however, stopped mid-step and sat down, its eyes still fixed on me, as if it understood. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Slowly, I backed away, my feet shuffling across the cold wooden floor until I reached the wall. My hand fumbled for the light switch. Maybe, just maybe, if I turned on the light, this would all disappear. Maybe the shadows would retreat, and the cat would finally leave. My fingers grazed the switch, and with a quick flick, the room was bathed in a harsh artificial glow. But the cat was still there, and so was the shadow. My stomach dropped. I had hoped, foolishly, that light would break whatever spell the house seemed to be under. Instead, the light only illuminated the details I hadn't seen before. The cat's fur shimmered unnaturally, like the very essence of night wrapped around a creature that didn't belong in this world. And the shadow, its form didn't fade or disperse under the light. If anything, it grew sharper, more defined. The space where its face should have been was still an empty void, a hollow nothingness. But I could see now that it had hands, long, thin fingers that twitched at its sides. I watched in horror as one of its hands reached out toward the cat. But the cat didn't shy away. It leaned into the touch, like it was welcoming the shadow's presence. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with two separate entities. They were one and the same, bound together in some unholy partnership. A soft, rhythmic tapping began, the kind I had heard in the walls before. Only now it was louder, more deliberate. I turned my head slowly, dread building in my chest, and saw the window. The same window where the cat always appeared, but something was wrong with it. The glass was vibrating, a faint pulse, as if it was breathing. Suddenly, I knew. The house wasn't just haunted by the cat or the shadow. It was the window. It had always been the window. I stumbled backward in a panic, my mind reeling. The landlord's cryptic words from the day I moved in echoed in my head. Watch the window. The window, with its old, grimy panes and its silent witness to the outside world, was the center of it all. The cat was drawn to it. The shadow seemed to form near it. And now it was alive, pulsating like a living thing, watching me. The glass began to crack, a hairline fracture slowly crawling across the surface. I had no idea what would happen if it broke, but instinctively, I knew it would be bad, worse than anything I'd experienced so far. Desperation kicked in. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the cat. The cat let out a low, guttural hiss, leaping out of the way with an eerie, unnatural grace. It darted back toward the window, pressing its body against the glass as if protecting it. The shadow followed, its long fingers dragging across the floor as it slithered closer to the window, like it was drawn to the cracks forming in the glass. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with a presence I couldn't explain. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the window. Tap, 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 like something on the other side was trying to get through. The cat turned its head toward me one last time. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, my legs trembling under the strain. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something, anything, before whatever was behind that window came through. I rushed forward, adrenaline pushing me beyond my fear, and grabbed the cat by the scruff of its neck. For a moment, it thrashed in my grip, hissing and scratching, but I held on, dragging it away from the window with all the strength I had. The moment the cat was away from the glass, the shadow let out a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It recoiled, its form flickering like a weak flame in the wind. The window, now unguarded, pulsed violently, the crack spreading rapidly across the entire pane. I could feel the presence behind it, pushing, trying to break through. In a last-ditch effort, I threw the cat to the floor and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a chair, swinging it with all my might toward the window. The glass shattered in a deafening explosion of sound, shards flying in every direction. I expected something to come through, some horrible creature or dark entity to flood the room, but instead, there was silence. The cat was gone. The shadow had vanished. The window lay in ruins, its shattered pieces scattered across the floor, but there was no trace of the strange presence I had felt moments ago. I stood there, panting, heart racing, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. It was over, or so I thought. That night, as I tried to sleep, I felt it, the faint pressure of eyes watching me from the darkness, from the place where the window had been. I wanted to believe it was over, that breaking the window had somehow severed the connection between this world and whatever strange, lurking presence had haunted my home. But deep down, I knew better. There was an energy in the house now, an electric hum that I could feel in my bones. The shadows in the corners felt thicker, the silence of the rooms unnervingly loud. Couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. The shattered window loomed in my mind, a gaping wound in the house, and the memory of the cat's glowing eyes still lingered. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the house settle and shift around me, waiting for the tap 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 to start again. But the tapping never came. By morning, the silence was suffocating. I told myself I'd imagined everything, that I'd been too tired, too stressed, that the mind plays tricks in the dark. But the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. I needed to get out, clear my head. I left the house without a second thought, heading to a nearby cafe, hoping that some fresh air and coffee would help me shake the dread that had taken root in my chest. The barista smiled when she handed me my coffee, but I could barely return it. My thoughts kept drifting back to the window. I had spent hours trying to convince myself that whatever had haunted the house was tied to that single point, that somehow the window was the source of everything. But if that were true, why did I still feel like I was being watched? I sipped my coffee, staring blankly out the cafe window, and that's when I noticed something. Across the street, hidden in the shadow of a crumbling old building, was a familiar shape, a black cat. Its fur gleamed in the early morning light, and its eyes, those same glowing, unnatural eyes, were fixed on me. It was the same cat, the same creature that had been in my house, perched in my window, watching, waiting. How had it followed me here? I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from the other patrons. The cat didn't move. It just sat there, its eyes burning into me like twin flames. My pulse quickened as I left the cafe and stepped into the street. I had to see if it was really there, or if my mind was finally unraveling. But as I got closer, the cat simply vanished. One moment, it was sitting there, staring at me, and the next, it was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, half expecting it to reappear, but there was nothing, just the empty street and the eerie silence that had followed me from the house. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where the cat had been. A creeping sense of dread crawled up my spine, but I forced myself to turn around and walk back home. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. When I returned to the house, the first thing I noticed was that the air felt heavier, thicker somehow. The broken window remained in pieces on the floor, but the house seemed different, darker. The light that filtered through the cracks in the curtains felt dimmer, as if something was swallowing it up before it could reach me. I hesitated at the front door, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me. But I couldn't stay outside. I had to face it. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the familiar creaks and groans of the old place greeted me like an old, unwanted friend. For a while, I just stood there in the hallway, listening. I didn't know what I was waiting for. The living room, where the window had shattered, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, but I couldn't bring myself to go back in there. Instead, I walked upstairs, hoping the higher ground might give me some distance from whatever lingered below. That night, I dreamt of the cat. In the dream, it wasn't just watching me from the window. It was inside the house, slinking through the rooms, its fur brushing against the walls like it was part of the shadows themselves. Everywhere it went, the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing the light and leaving nothing but an oppressive void in its wake. But it wasn't the cat that frightened me. In the dream, I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and I could feel it, something standing at the foot of my bed. I was too afraid to move, to turn my head, but I could hear it, that low, familiar tapping. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate, like fingers drumming on the wood. Then, without warning, the bed sank as if someone, or something, had climbed onto it. The air around me grew cold, impossibly cold, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My body was paralyzed with fear. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then I saw it. The cat, sitting on my chest, its glowing eyes boring into mine. But behind it, in the shadows at the foot of the bed, was the watcher. The faceless figure, standing still and silent, its long, thin arms reaching out toward me. I could feel its fingers brush against my legs, cold and unnatural. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt alive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for the tap-tap-tap that I had heard in my dream. It was real. The tapping was coming from downstairs, from the broken window. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend that it was just my imagination, that this was all some nightmare I hadn't fully woken from. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, guiding me down the hallway like a terrible, unspoken command. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The living room door was wide open, and there, standing in the shattered window, silhouetted by the faint moonlight, was the cat. It turned its head slowly toward me, eyes glowing with that same unnatural fire. But this time it wasn't alone. The shadow stood behind it, its faceless head tilted in my direction, as if waiting for something. And as I stood there, helpless and terrified, the cat let out a low, rumbling purr, as if it had been expecting me all along. It was waiting for me to let it in. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the shadows warping and twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, all I could do was stand there, staring at the black cat in the window and the dark figure behind it. They were waiting for me, both of them, and I didn't want to know why. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deep silence that felt even worse. It was a silence full of expectation, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I knew I couldn't stay there, frozen in fear, but moving felt impossible. My legs felt like lead, my body like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And yet, as much as I wanted to run, to leave this house behind and never look back, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the cat. It sat there, perched in the broken window, its eyes glowing with that eerie, knowing light, almost as if it was smiling. I took a slow step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Maybe if I left the room, if I went back upstairs and locked the door behind me, it would leave. Maybe the cat, and the thing that followed it, would disappear the way it had when I broke the window. But the moment I moved, the cat shifted. Its head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing, and it let out a low, rumbling hiss that reverberated through the room. My retreat stopped dead. Behind it, the shadow began to stir. It leaned forward, its long arms reaching toward the edges of the broken window, and I could hear the faint sound of its fingers dragging across the glass, like nails scraping a chalkboard. Slowly, it began to crawl through the opening. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the old rug as I desperately tried to get away. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled toward the stairs, my mind screaming for me to run. But the moment I reached the bottom step, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down, horrified, and saw one of the shadow's hands gripping me, its thin, bony fingers curling around my leg like ice-cold vines. It didn't pull me, not yet. It just held me there, as if testing my strength, as if curious to see how I would react. I kicked at it, trying to free myself, but the grip only tightened. The cold spread up my leg, numbing me, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was being drained of something vital, something that kept me tethered to this world. The cat's purring grew louder, almost like a hum, as if it was pleased with the shadow's progress. It watched, unblinking, as the shadow's other hand reached out, stretching toward me. Its fingers curled in the air, reaching for my arm, my chest, as though it were claiming me for something I couldn't understand. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body paralyzed by the icy grip on my ankle. The only thing I could do was stare, helpless, as the shadow drew closer. Its form was still faceless, still a void of darkness, but I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. Then, without warning, the cat moved. In one swift motion, it jumped from the window and landed silently on the floor in front of me. It was closer now, so close I could hear its breathing, feel the strange warmth that radiated from its body. Its eyes gleamed with that terrible, unnatural light, and it stared directly into mine, unblinking. Something flickered in those eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. Intelligence, awareness. The cat wasn't just a creature of the house. It was aware of what it was doing. It wanted this. My vision blurred as the cold from the shadow spread further up my leg, crawling like frostbite. My mind raced, searching for something, anything that could stop this. But the house, the cat, the window, it all felt like some twisted trap, and I was caught in the center of it. The cat tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, I saw something that shook me to my core. A face, flickering, shifting, but there. Not human, not fully, but close enough. The shadow wasn't just some entity. It had once been something. Something alive. Something real. And the cat. The cat had brought it here, had kept it here, tied to the window, tied to this house. It was feeding it. And now it was feeding it me. I don't know where the strength came from, but in that moment, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was survival instinct, maybe it was pure desperation, but I suddenly yanked my leg back with everything I had. The shadow's grip loosened for just a second, and I used that second to pull free, tumbling backward onto the stairs. The cat hissed, a sharp, furious sound that cut through the silence like a knife. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as if weakened, but I didn't stop to question why. I scrambled up the stairs, my limbs shaking, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door to my bedroom shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The cold hadn't left me. I could still feel it, seeping into my bones, and the air in the room was thick with that awful, oppressive energy. I backed away from the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second, the shadow spilling into the room, the cat with its glowing eyes leading the charge. But nothing happened. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I glanced toward the window in my room. It was intact, unbroken, but the pale light of the moon cast strange shadows on the floor, twisting and curling like fingers. I watched those shadows, too afraid to move, waiting for something to emerge from them. And then I heard it, a faint scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate. I backed up further, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized, whatever was behind the door, it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear. The sound wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the window behind me. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I turned around. There, outside the glass, perched on the windowsill in the pale light of the moon, was the cat. Its eyes glowed like embers, and behind it, barely visible in the shadows, I could see the faint outline of the watcher waiting. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. The cat sat there, unervingly still, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, as if daring me to make a move. Behind it, the shadow hovered, its form barely visible in the darkness. The window pane stood between us like a thin veil, fragile and breakable, and I knew that whatever protection it offered wouldn't last. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the room again, coming from both the window and the door. It was like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, a reminder that I was cornered. There was no escape, not anymore. The cold crept into the room, seeping through the walls, the floor, the very air itself. My breath came in shallow bursts, clouding in front of me as I struggled to think clearly. I could feel the presence of the cat and the shadow tightening around me, like a net drawing in. I stepped backward, my back pressing against the far wall. The bedroom felt impossibly small now, the walls closing in, the air thick with the weight of something watching, waiting. The scratching at the door intensified, louder now, as if the shadow was no longer content to linger outside. It wanted in. I stared at the window, the cat still perched there, and for a brief moment, I thought about smashing the glass, forcing it away. But something told me that if I broke that window, I'd be inviting the shadow in. It would no longer have to crawl through the cracks. It would simply flood in, taking everything with it, including me. The cat blinked, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew what I was thinking. It tilted its head to one side, its body motionless, but its eyes, those glowing, fiery eyes, never left mine. They were pulling me in, deeper and deeper, like a current dragging me under. I had to move. I had to do something before the house swallowed me whole. Desperately, I looked around the room for anything that could help. My eyes landed on an old wardrobe in the corner, a piece of furniture that had been left behind by the previous owner. It was massive, heavy, the kind of thing that had likely been in the house for decades. Without thinking, I rushed toward it, grabbing the edge and pulling it with all my strength. It groaned and scraped against the floor as I pushed it toward the door. My arms ached, my muscles burning, but I managed to wedge it in front of the door, blocking it, at least for now. The scratching stopped abruptly, as if whatever was behind the door had paused, waiting, calculating. I backed away from the wardrobe, my heart hammering in my chest. The door might be blocked, but the window was still wide open. The cat shifted. It stood slowly, arching its back, stretching its legs. Its eyes narrowed as it began to pace along the edge of the windowsill, moving with an unnatural grace. Behind it, the shadow stirred again, the outline of its form more solid now, more defined. It leaned closer to the glass, its long fingers pressing against the pane, the tips of them scraping ever so slightly. I pressed myself against the wall, staring at the window, waiting for the glass to give way. My mind raced with panic, searching for a way out, but every idea seemed impossible. The cat, this creature, wasn't just a simple haunting. It wasn't a ghost. Why? The question gnawed at me as I stood there, trembling. Why had it chosen me? What did it want? The house had been empty for years before I moved in. The landlord had been eager to rent it, almost too eager. I thought back to that day, to the way he had muttered something about the window, his words lost in the shuffle of signing papers. What had he known? What had he been hiding? The cat's purring grew louder, almost vibrating through the air, pulling me back to the present. It was watching me again, waiting for something. Its eyes seemed to glow brighter, and in that moment, I realized it wasn't waiting for me to escape. It was waiting for me to look. There was something in the window, something beyond the glass, hidden in the darkness. With a shaking breath, I forced myself to step closer, my feet moving on their own. I didn't want to look, but something deep inside me, some primal instinct, demanded that I understand what was happening, that I face it. As I approached the window, the air grew colder, the shadows deepening around me. The cat didn't move. It just watched, its eyes following my every step. I could feel the weight of its gaze, feel the presence of the shadow looming just behind it. And then I saw it. Reflected in the glass, just faintly, was a figure. A human shape, distorted and blurred, but unmistakable. It was standing behind me, its long fingers stretching toward my shoulders, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure's face was a void, just like the shadows. But this wasn't the same. This was something else, something familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. It was me. It wasn't a shadow. It was me, twisted and warped, like a version of myself from some other world, some other existence. The cat had brought it here through the window. The window wasn't just a barrier between the house and the outside, it was a gateway, a portal. And now, the thing on the other side wanted to take my place. I stumbled back, my head spinning, the room tilting around me. The reflection in the window twisted and flickered, its hand reaching out, closer and closer, as if it was trying to pull me into the glass. The cat let out a low growl, a sound so deep it shook the floor beneath me. The shadow behind it surged forward, pressing its faceless head against the glass, its long fingers spreading out, ready to breach the barrier. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, an old lamp from the nightstand, and hurled it at the window with all my strength. The glass shattered. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The cat leaped back, hissing, as the shadow recoiled violently. The window was gone, its pieces scattered across the floor, and outside, the night seemed darker than ever before. But the figure, the thing that had been in the reflection, was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, the cold air from outside rushing into the room. The house seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as if they were finally releasing the tension that had built up over so many years. And then, silence. I sank to the floor, my body shaking, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The cat was gone. The shadow was gone. The watcher in the window had finally disappeared. But as I sat there, staring at the broken glass, a terrible realization crept over me. The reflection may have been gone from the window, but I could still feel it inside me. Something had come through the glass that night, and it wasn't leaving. The house was quiet now, the kind of eerie stillness that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. But something wasn't right. I could still feel it, that weight, that oppressive feeling of being watched. Only now it wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from within me. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion. I had been through too much, the sleepless nights, the terror of the cat, the shadow. My body was shaking, my thoughts tangled. But as I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, I felt a subtle shift, a tug at the edges of my consciousness, like something just out of reach, pulling me into a darkness I couldn't see. I got to my feet, unsteady, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. The room looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Everything seemed off. The shadows in the corners were darker than they should have been, the air heavier, like it was pressing against my skin. And then I noticed it, in the mirror across the room, my reflection. At first it looked normal, just me, standing there, pale and shaken. But as I took a step closer, my heart skipping in my chest, I realized something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't like the shadow in the window. This was different. This was me, but not me. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, mimicking the way the cat had done, and a cold, creeping horror spread through me. I tried to move, to lift my hand, but my reflection didn't follow. It just stood there, eyes locked onto mine, its face twisted into an expression that didn't belong on my own face. It was smiling, a smile that was too wide, too knowing, a smile that said, "I'm here now." I stumbled back, knocking into the nightstand, my hand trembling as I reached for something, anything to ground myself. But the feeling, the tug, the darkness, it was inside me now. I could feel it like a shadow wrapping itself around my mind, pulling me down, deeper and deeper into a cold, empty void. And that's when I heard it, a soft, familiar purring. I turned slowly, dread creeping up my spine. There, sitting on the windowsill again, as if nothing had ever happened, was the black cat. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, the same fiery intensity that had haunted me from the beginning. It watched me, unblinking, and behind it, I could see the faint outline of the shattered window. The broken glass shimmered faintly in the moonlight, like a portal still half open. The cat's gaze pierced through me, and I realized then, with a chilling certainty, that it had never been just about the window. The cat had been leading me here all along, drawing me closer, wearing me down. The window was only part of the story. It wanted in, and now it was in. My reflection, the thing in the mirror, smiled wider, its eyes darkening, the light fading from them as if something was closing over the surface, swallowing them whole. I watched in horror as the figure in the mirror began to move, slowly at first, then more fluidly. It raised its hand, as if testing its newfound freedom, and I could feel it, deep inside me, something loosening, slipping. I stepped back, my legs weak beneath me, my body trembling as the thing in the mirror took a step forward. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this was, it wasn't me anymore. It had become me in a way I couldn't understand, and there was no escaping it. The cat purred again, louder now, the sound vibrating through the room, filling the silence. It leapt from the windowsill, landing softly on the floor, and began to walk toward me, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was taking its time, savoring the moment. I backed up against the wall, trapped, the mirror behind me, the cat in front of me. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The house had swallowed me whole, and now it was finishing the job. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its smile stretching impossibly wide, its eyes hollow now, black pits that seemed to pull in all the light from the room. It reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass from the inside. I felt a cold, terrible pull as it began to slip through, merging with the shadows around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt heavy, my limbs numb, and as the figure moved closer, I realized with dawning horror what was happening. I wasn't just losing myself. I was being replaced. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed over me was the cat, sitting calmly at my feet, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. It blinked once, slowly, and for the first time I understood. The cat had never been the threat. It had been the invitation. And now I was on the other side of the window, trapped, watching,